Shortly after midnight on the 2nd of January 1968, the temperature at Edinburgh's Royal Observatory on Blackford Hill began to fall. Not gradually, not gently. It dropped like a stone. Within 3 hours, the mercury would plunge by 10 degrees. By dawn, 20 centimetres of snow would bury Scotland's capital. And Edinburgh, a city of 500,000 people, would be cut off from the rest of Britain. This is the story of the blizzard that paralysed a nation's railways, trapped thousands of travellers, and reminded Britain that winter was far from finished with 1967. To understand what happened on that bitter January night, you have to go back 4 weeks, to the 6th of December, 1967. That was the day the Arctic first reached south. A violent northerly outbreak swept down across the British Isles, and for the next 2 months it barely let go. Polar low after polar low rolled in from the north, each one dragging freezing air from the Norwegian Sea straight across Scotland and into the English Midlands. The first blow came between the 6th and 10th of December. 2 polar lows developed in quick succession. Snow fell across western areas of Britain with savage intensity. In North Wales, 43 centimetres accumulated. Across the West Midlands, 23 centimetres lay on the ground. Along the south coast, where the comparatively warm waters of the English Channel fed moisture into the unstable polar air, heavy snow showers hammered coastal towns that rarely saw more than a dusting. It was a punishing start, and it was only the beginning. Through the rest of December the pattern repeated. Cold air surged south, dumped snow, retreated briefly, then surged again. Christmas, 1967, brought its own drama. Parts of the Midlands, from northeast Wales to Buckinghamshire, woke to an unforecast white Christmas as rain turned to wet snow on Christmas Eve. Birmingham recorded 10 centimetres. Some locations saw 25. It was the first proper white Christmas for many areas since 1938. But while children celebrated, railway controllers knew that each successive cold snap was draining resources and exhausting crews. British Rail's Scottish region watched the forecast with growing unease. The network was still carrying the institutional scars of the catastrophic winter of 1962-63, the big freeze that had paralysed the country for 10 consecutive weeks. Lessons had been learned from that disaster. Point heaters had been installed at key junctions across the system. Over 2,180 heating units were now operational, compared to just 766 during the 63 winter. Each unit cost £105 to install. Equipping all 100,000 switch points across the entire network would have cost £10.2 million, a sum that was simply out of the question. So heaters were placed only at critical junctions, leaving thousands of secondary points exposed to whatever winter chose to deliver. Snowplow locomotives stood ready at depots from Inverness to Carlisle. The Scottish region maintained a fleet of independent wedge ploughs and smaller rail-mounted ploughs that could be fitted to the front of Class 20 and Class 37 diesels. Depot foremen had checked and rechecked the equipment through December, knowing that the pattern of repeated northerly outbreaks showed no sign of breaking. But equipment is only as good as the warning it receives, and the blizzard that struck Edinburgh on the 2nd of January came with a ferocity that caught even seasoned railwaymen off guard. The setup was textbook. A deep, low-pressure system tracked northeast across the Atlantic, pulling a vicious cold front behind it. Ahead of the front, mild air still lingered across southern Britain. Behind it, Arctic air waited like a wall of ice. The front moved south through Scotland during the early hours of January the 2nd, and where it passed the transformation was instant. Temperatures in southern Britain collapsed by 10 degrees Celsius in just 3 hours. Rain turned to sleet. Sleet turned to snow. And in Edinburgh, the snow did not stop. Edinburgh Waverley Station sat in its deep valley between the old town and the new town, its vast glass roof spanning nearly 9 acres. By 1968, it was the undisputed heart of Scotland's railway network. The rival Princes Street Station, operated by the Old Caledonian Railway, had closed 3 years earlier in 1965. Everything now funneled through Waverley. Every train to London King's Cross, every service to Glasgow Queen Street, every connection to Aberdeen, Inverness and the Borders, 20 platforms, over 100 daily departures, all of them now threatened by 20 centimetres of snow and falling temperatures. The problems began on the approaches. The East Coast Main Line south of Edinburgh climbed through exposed terrain towards the Lammermuir Hills, drifting snow-blocked cuttings within hours. Points froze despite the heaters. Signal wires, still semaphore-operated on secondary routes, seized in their pulleys. The line to Glasgow via Shotts, crossing high ground at over 300 metres, became impassable before dawn. The Waverley route south to Carlisle via Hawick, already under threat of closure and running a skeleton service, ground to a halt somewhere in the Borders Hills. Inside Waverley, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Departure boards showed delay after delay. Platform staff relayed what information they could, but in 1968 there were no electronic displays, no mobile telephones, no automated announcements. There were men with chalk and blackboards, there were tannoy calls echoing under the glass roof, and there were hundreds of travellers who had hoped to return home after the New Year holiday, now stranded in a station that was growing colder by the hour. The blizzard did not confine itself to Edinburgh. As the cold front swept south through the day on January the 2nd, it carved a path of disruption from North Wales across the Midlands to southeast England. The band of heavy snow was broad and relentless. Towns that had enjoyed relatively mild conditions just hours earlier found themselves buried under a white blanket. Railway operations across central England descended into crisis. Diesel multiple units, the workhorses of British Rail's local services in the late 1960s, were particularly vulnerable to heavy snowfall. These lightweight trains sat low to the ground, and snow packed into their underframes with alarming speed, sometimes accumulating up to 3 tons beneath a single vehicle. This weight alone could damage suspension and brake rigging, but the real danger came when compacted snow and ice interfered with braking systems. Frozen brake blocks meant trains could not stop reliably on gradients. Frozen points meant trains could not be routed safely through junctions. And when both problems occurred simultaneously, as they did repeatedly on the night of January the 2nd, the only option was to suspend services altogether. The situation with locomotive-hauled trains was scarcely better. Mainline services between Edinburgh and London relied on diesel locomotives hauling Mark II coaches. These trains were steam-heated with hot water piped from the locomotive through the length of the train to keep passengers warm. In extreme cold, the heating systems were prone to failure. Pipes froze. Connections between coaches leaked. Passengers who had already endured hours of delay now sat in carriages where the temperature dropped below freezing. It was a miserable experience, and one that British Rail's management knew damaged public confidence in the railway, at a time when car ownership was rising, and the case for line closures was being argued with increasing vigour. In Scotland, the situation was worse. The country's geography conspired against the railway. Lines that ran through deep cuttings became snow traps, with drifts building to heights that no ordinary train could penetrate. The Highland Main Line north of Perth disappeared under white drifts. Branch lines across the central belt were abandoned one by one. Even the main Edinburgh to Glasgow route via Falkirk, usually the last to succumb, reported severe delays as crews battled frozen infrastructure. The men who fought the snow were not office workers or managers. They were permanent way gangs, signalmen, locomotive drivers and guards. They worked through the night of January the 2nd with hand tools and determination. At remote signal boxes across the Scottish lowlands, signalmen kept coal fires burning not for comfort but for survival, manually working frozen lever frames that required enormous physical effort in normal conditions and near superhuman strength when ice gripped every mechanism. Snowplow operations commenced before dawn on the 3rd of January. British Rail's Scottish region deployed its fleet of independent snowplows, massive wedge-shaped vehicles positioned between 2 diesel locomotives that could force through drifts of considerable depth. Class 37 diesels hauled the ploughs on main routes, their 1,750 horsepower engines straining against walls of compacted snow. On secondary lines, lighter equipment was used, but even the most powerful plough was useless against drifts that reformed within minutes of being cleared. The problem was not just the quantity of snow, it was the wind. Blizzard conditions meant that freshly cleared tracks could be blocked again within half an hour. Crews would fight their way through a cutting, only to find that by the time they reached the far end, the entrance behind them had already filled in. It was exhausting, demoralising, and seemingly endless work. Edinburgh itself presented unique challenges. The city's dramatic topography, built across a series of volcanic hills and deep valleys, created wind tunnels that drove snow into particular areas with concentrated fury. Arthur's Seat, the extinct volcano that dominates Edinburgh's eastern skyline, stood at 251 metres and acted as a barrier that accelerated winds through the gaps between the Old Town Ridge and Calton Hill. Prince's Street, running along the northern edge of Waverley's Valley, became a wind-scoured channel where pedestrians could barely stand upright. Road transport fared no better than the railways. The main arterial roads into Edinburgh, the A1 from the south and east, the A8 from Glasgow, the A90 from the Forth Road Bridge, all became impassable. The Forth Road Bridge itself, opened just 4 years earlier in 1964, was closed to traffic as crosswinds made crossing dangerous. For a period measured in hours rather than days, Edinburgh was genuinely isolated, a capital city of a major European nation, cut off by 20 centimetres of snow. By the afternoon of January the 3rd, the worst had passed. The cold front had moved through, leaving clear skies and bitter temperatures in its wake. A minimum of minus 9.4 degrees Celsius was recorded at Caldecott in Rutland on January the 4th, giving some indication of just how cold the air mass behind the front truly was. The recovery operation began immediately. On the railways, priority was given to clearing the East Coast Main Line to restore the vital Edinburgh to London service. Snowplow trains worked systematically southward from Edinburgh, while other crews worked northward from Newcastle. Point heaters were checked and recharged, signal equipment was thawed and tested. By the evening of January the 3rd, a limited service had been restored on the main line, though delays of several hours remained common for days afterward. Secondary routes took longer. The line through the borders via Galashiels and Hawick, already running on borrowed time before the beaching axe finally fell, was among the last to reopen. This was the Waverley route, 198 miles of railway threading through some of Scotland's most exposed and beautiful terrain. Gradients of 1 in 80, bleak moorland summits, deep cuttings that acted as perfect snow traps. By the timetable of May 1968, the route would be reduced to just one through service each way to London St Pancras, 3 services to Carlisle and 2 to Hawick. By January 1969 it would be gone entirely, closed by Transport Minister Richard Marsh, despite a petition of nearly 12,000 signatures. But in January 1968, the Waverley route was still open, still struggling, and still the only transport link for dozens of small communities in the Scottish borders when the roads disappeared under snow. The irony was not lost on local residents. Here was a railway that the government deemed unnecessary, yet when blizzard conditions made every road impassable, it was the only lifeline these remote towns possessed. The few trains that did manage to fight through the drifts on the Waverley route carried not just passengers, but essential supplies for communities that would otherwise have been completely isolated. The blizzard of January 1968 was not an isolated event. It was one episode in a winter defined by repeated assaults from the north. From the 6th of December 1967 to the 7th of February 1968, a period of exactly 9 weeks, northerly outbreaks occurred with a regularity that exhausted resources and tested infrastructure to its limits. Each outbreak brought fresh snow. Each fresh snowfall compounded the problems of the previous one. Ice accumulated on structures, equipment fatigue increased, and the men who maintained the railway grew wearier with each passing week. Just 2 weeks after the Edinburgh blizzard, on the 15th of January 1968, Scotland was struck by something far worse. The Glasgow storm known as Hurricane Low-Q brought winds of 134 miles per hour recorded at Great Dun Fell in Westmorland. 20 people died. In Glasgow alone, over 300 houses were destroyed and 70,000 homes were damaged. 700 people were left homeless. It was described as central Scotland's worst natural disaster since records began. The January 2nd blizzard now seemed almost trivial by comparison. But for the railway workers who had fought through that freezing night at Edinburgh Waverley, for the signal operators who had manually worked frozen lever frames until their hands bled, for the snowplow crews who had spent hours trapped in cuttings with snow piling around their locomotives, it had been anything but trivial. The winter of 1967-68 taught British rail lessons that would echo through the decades. The importance of weather forecasting for operational planning, the need for robust point heating systems, the value of maintaining snowplow capability even during mild winters when the equipment seemed unnecessary, and perhaps most importantly, The recognition that Britain's railway network, threaded through some of the most exposed terrain in Western Europe, would always be vulnerable to the kind of weather that the winter of 67 to 68 delivered with such relentless regularity. Edinburgh recovered, the snow melted, the trains ran again. Waverley Station returned to its normal rhythm of departures and arrivals. But for those who lived through that night, the memory persisted. The sound of wind howling through the glass roof, the sight of snow drifting across empty platforms, the eerie silence of a great railway station with nowhere for its trains to go. 20 centimetres. That was all it took. 20 centimetres of snow, driven by Arctic wind, falling on a city that thought it was prepared. Falling on a railway that had spent 5 years and millions of pounds preparing for exactly this kind of weather. Falling on a nation that had endured the big freeze of 63 and believed the worst was behind it.